The phone rang at 2:03 a.m. A cop said, "We found your grandson wandering the highway. He's safe, but scared." I laughed. My 9-year-old grandson was sleeping in the room next to mine. I walked to his doorway and watched him breathe. He was there. So I told the officer, "You got the wrong kid." He paused for 3 seconds. Then he whispered, "Sir, this boy has your grandson's exact face." My blood went cold. I called my son, who hadn't spoken to me in 7 years. He answered and said, "He's already gone to me." I grabbed my keys and drove into the storm. I had 2 grandsons now, and I didn't know which one was real. But to understand how I ended up in that chair with those 2 names in front of me, I have to go back to a phone call at 2 in the morning. The phone screamed through the dead silence of my ranch house at 2:03 in the morning, and at 68 years old, I knew that sound never carried good news. I reached for it with hands that hadn't moved quickly in years. Decades of fence posts and cattle gates and Texas sun had turned my knuckles into something closer to bark than skin, and my fingers fumbled twice before I got the receiver to my ear. The bedroom was pitch dark except for the blue glow of the phone screen cutting across the ceiling like a blade. My name is Virgil Caldwell. I am a retired cattle rancher with a quiet fortune I never talk about, and a farmhouse outside Stephenville that smells like cedar and old leather and the ghost of my late wife's perfume. That October of 2024, I had lived alone on this land for 6 years, ever since Ruth Ann passed, except for the 9-year-old boy sleeping in the room 10 feet from mine. My grandson, Colton. The only person left in this world I would die for without thinking twice. "Mr. Caldwell?" The voice on the other end was deep and worn down, the kind of voice that comes from a man halfway through a double shift who has already seen too much for one night. "This is Deputy Harlan Bates, Erath County Sheriff's Office. I apologize for the hour, sir." I sat up in bed and put my bare feet on the cold hardwood floor. The rain was hammering the tin roof so hard I had to press the phone against my ear to hear him. "What happened?" I said. "Sir, we picked up a boy tonight walking barefoot along the shoulder of Highway 377 in the storm, 9 years old, give or take. No shoes, no identification, no adult in sight. He hasn't spoken a word since we brought him in. At my age, you learn to read silence." And the 3 seconds of silence that followed told me more than any words could. Deputy Bates was not finished. He was gathering himself for the part that didn't make sense. "Your name came up in our county youth safety database," he continued. "The facial recognition flagged a partial match to a child registered under your household. Your grandson, Colton Caldwell." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was impossible. "Officer," I said, "that is absolutely impossible. My grandson is fast asleep in the room right next to mine. Has been since 8:30. I read him a chapter of a Western paperback and watched him close his eyes myself." Another silence, longer this time. I could hear the fluorescent hum of a station lobby behind him and the faint sound of rain hitting a window on his end, too. "Mr. Caldwell, I understand what you're telling me," he said, "and I have no reason to doubt you, but I need you to hear what I'm about to say." I stood up. My knees cracked like dry branches. I walked out of my bedroom and into the hallway, the floor cold under my feet, and I stopped at the open doorway of Colton's room. The nightlight cast a soft amber glow across his bed. His patchwork quilt rose and fell with each slow breath. His left hand was curled under his chin the way it always was. He was real. He was safe. He was right here. "He's right here," I said into the phone, breathing. "Safe. This makes no sense." I was staring at my grandson. He was breathing. He was real. And somehow, according to a county deputy 30 miles away, he was also standing in a sheriff's station in the middle of a thunderstorm with no shoes on. Deputy Bates lowered his voice. Not to a whisper exactly, but to something close, the kind of volume a man uses when he is standing near someone he does not want to overhear. "Sir," he said, "I am looking at this child right now, and he has your grandson's exact face." The rain hit the tin roof above me like a warning drum. I pressed my shoulder against the hallway wall because my legs had decided they were done holding me up. The cedar smell of the house wrapped around me the way it always did, familiar and safe, but nothing felt safe anymore. Not the hallway, not the dark, not the small sleeping shape under the quilt. My late wife, Ruth Ann, used to say that trouble doesn't knock. It kicks the door clean off the hinges. She was right about that. She was right about most things. And she had been right about our son Garrett, too, though I hadn't wanted to hear it at the time. 4 years of silence. That is how long it had been since Garrett called, wrote, or showed any sign that he remembered he had a father. 4 years since he dropped off a 5-year-old boy on my porch with a duffel bag and a story about needing time to get his life together. 4 years since he walked back to his truck without looking at the boy and drove away. I hung up the phone and stood perfectly still in that dark hallway. My grandson was asleep under his quilt, but somewhere out in that storm, another boy wore his face. And standing there with the rain coming down and the house creaking around me, I had a sickening feeling, deep in my gut, in the place where a father knows things he doesn't want to know, that my own son knew exactly why. I looked at the phone in my hand. I hadn't dialed Garrett's number in 4 years. Tonight, I was going to have to. I dialed the number before I could talk myself out of it. My thumb hovered for just a moment over digits I hadn't pressed in 4 years, and then I pushed through the way you push through a door leads somewhere bad, because standing still was worse. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. I stood in the hallway outside Colton's room with rain hammering the roof and my bare feet going numb on the hardwood. I expected voicemail. I expected silence. What I got was worse. Garrett Caldwell, my 42-year-old son, a corporate financial advisory director in Dallas who hadn't spoken to me since the year his mother died, picked up on the 4th ring. There was no grogginess in his voice, no confusion, no rustling of sheets or clearing of a throat. He was already awake at 2 a.m, and that was the first thing that turned my stomach. "Garrett," I said, "police just called me. They found a boy walking Highway 377 in the storm tonight, 9 years old. They say he has Colton's face. You want to tell me what the hell is going on?" Silence, not the stunned kind. The calculating kind. "He's already gone to me," Garrett said. Flat, final, like he was closing a file. "What do you mean, gone to you?" I gripped the doorframe of Colton's room. "What boy are you talking about?" "Don't get involved, Dad. This doesn't concern you. A child was found barefoot on a highway in a thunderstorm, and the sheriff's office called my house. It concerns me." I said, "Leave it alone." The line went dead. What kind of father hears that a child has been found wandering a highway in a storm and responds with nothing but cold, administrative detachment? Not a worried father, not a confused one, a father who already knew the boy was out there and had decided, before the phone even rang, that it wasn't his problem. I stood there with the dead phone in my hand for maybe 10 seconds. Then I moved. I pulled on jeans and boots and the canvas ranch jacket hanging by the back door. I crossed the yard in the rain to the foreman's cottage and knocked until a light came on. Darlene Gentry, the foreman's wife, opened the door in her bathrobe with her reading glasses still on. "Colton's asleep," I told her. "I need to go to the sheriff's station. Don't know when I'll be back." She didn't ask why. She never did. She just nodded and walked across the yard toward my house in her slippers, rain soaking her shoulders, and I was in the truck before she reached the porch. The drive from the ranch to the Erath County Sheriff's Office takes 35 minutes in daylight and good weather. In a blinding October downpour with the roads half flooded, it took closer to 50. I gripped the steering wheel with both hands, my knuckles white, the wipers slapping back water faster than the sky could throw it. The headlights cut tunnels through the rain and showed me nothing but empty road and fence post disappearing into black. The windshield wipers beat back the rain, but nothing could clear the fog settling over my mind, the slow, suffocating realization that my son had been lying to me and that I had let him because the alternative was too ugly to look at. I thought about the night 4 years ago. October, just like this one. Rain, just like this. Garrett had pulled into my driveway at 11 at night in a rental car with his wife Jolene in the passenger seat and a 5-year-old boy asleep in the back. The boy had a duffel bag and a face full of exhaustion and nothing else. "Just a few months, Dad," Garrett had said, standing on the porch with his collar turned up against the wind. "We need to stabilize things, you understand." "Of course I'll take the boy," I told him. "He's my grandson." Garrett nodded once. He didn't hug the child. He didn't go back inside to tuck him in or whisper goodbye. He walked to the rental car, and Jolene, who hadn't gotten out at all, turned her face away from the porch light as they pulled out. I never got a clear look at her that night. I'd always assumed she was crying. Now, driving through this storm 4 years later, I wasn't sure she had been feeling anything at all. A few months turned into a year. A year turned into 4. And in all that time, 4 years, 48 months, more than 1,400 days of raising that boy, feeding him, reading to him, sitting with him through fevers and nightmares in the first day of 2nd grade. Garrett never once called to ask how Colton was doing. Ruth Ann had warned me. On her last night in the hospice bed, she gripped my hand with the little strength she had left and told me Garrett would sell his own shadow if the price was right. I told her she was being dramatic. I was the fool. I was always the fool when it came to my son because loving your child means building a wall between what you see and what you know, and I had built that wall higher than any fence on my ranch. I pulled into the gravel lot of the sheriff's station, killed the engine, and sat in the dark cab listening to the rain pound the roof. Garrett had not asked a single question about the boy. He had not asked if the child was safe, or cold, or frightened. He already knew. And that terrified me more than anything waiting behind those glass doors. I opened the truck door and stepped into the rain. Whatever was waiting inside that station, sitting in my truck wasn't going to change it. Garrett's voice was still ringing in my ears. Flat, cold, already done with the child he should have been screaming about. And the only thing keeping my legs moving was the thought that a 9-year-old boy was sitting alone behind a locked door with nobody coming for him except me. The fluorescent lights inside the Erath County Sheriff's Office hit me like a slap after 40 minutes of darkness. Deputy Bates was standing by the front desk with his arms crossed and an expression that told me he wished he hadn't made that call. He looked me over. Soaked canvas jacket, mud on my boots, a face that probably looked about 10 years older than it had 3 hours ago, and nodded once. "Follow me," he said. I didn't make small talk, didn't offer coffee. He led me down a narrow corridor with wet boot prints on the linoleum and the stale smell of old coffee hanging in the air like something that had given up trying to leave. The overhead lights hummed the way they do in places where people wait for bad news. A dispatch radio crackled somewhere behind a closed door, and then it was quiet again. Bates stopped at a window halfway down the hall. Two-way observation glass, the kind you see on television shows. He turned to me and put one hand on my shoulder. Not a casual touch, a steadying one. "Before you look, Mr. Caldwell," he said, "I want you to prepare yourself. I've been doing this job 18 years and I've never seen anything like it. I have stared down charging bulls and collapsing fence lines without flinching. I rebuilt my barn after the tornado of 2011 with 2 cracked ribs and a level that wouldn't sit straight. But looking through that glass, my knees nearly buckled." The boy was sitting on a metal folding chair in the center of a small room with nothing in it but a table and a water bottle he hadn't touched. He was soaked to the bone. A gray emergency blanket was wrapped around his shoulders, but it had slipped to one side, and I could see his collarbone pressing against his skin like a ridge of bone trying to escape. His feet were bare, dirty, scratched. His shins were bruised. Not fresh bruises, but the layered yellow-green kind that come from weeks of bumping into things in the dark or being bumped into by someone who didn't care. He was painfully, terribly thin, and he had Colton's face, not a similar face, not a resemblance. The same face, the same dark eyes set under the same brow, the same jaw, narrow and slightly pointed, that I had watched change shape over 4 years of suppers at my kitchen table. The same small ears, the same slight overbite that the dentist in Stephenville had told me Colton would grow out of by 12. How do you explain a child who shares your grandson's face down to the last detail but sits in a police station 30 miles away, starving and alone? You don't explain it. You just stand there with your hand against the glass and feel the world split in two. "I ran his prints through the youth safety database twice," Bates said behind me. "Partial match to your family file both times. Not conclusive, but strong enough that I had no choice but to call you." I barely heard him. I was watching the boy's mouth. He was biting his lower lip, not chewing it, not gnawing at it, but pressing his front teeth into the soft tissue on the left side in a quick, rhythmic pulse. Over and over, a nervous habit. Colton does the exact same thing, has done it since he was 5 years old. Same side, same rhythm, same small dent it leaves in the skin afterward. I had asked his pediatrician about it once, and the man told me it was involuntary, a stress response hardwired into the nervous system. Not something you pick up from watching someone, something you're born with. I pressed my palm flat against the cold glass. The boy flinched at something I couldn't see, maybe a sound, maybe nothing at all, and his whole body went rigid. His eyes darted to the door, then to the corner, then to his own feet. It was the posture of a child who had been conditioned to expect harm from every direction. Not frightened the way a lost child is frightened, with tears and calling out. Frightened the way an animal is frightened, silent, still, ready to run. I built fences my whole life to keep things safe inside, but no fence in the world could have protected me from what I was seeing through that glass. This boy had not been lost tonight. He had been lost for years. The bare feet, the visible ribs, the bruised shins, the flinching. None of this was new damage. Someone had been failing this child for a very long time, and he had learned to survive it by making himself as small and as quiet as possible. I lowered my hand from the glass and turned to Deputy Bates. My voice came out steadier than I expected, given that my entire world had just cracked down the center. "That boy is not a stranger," I said. "I don't know how, and I don't know why, but that child belongs to my blood, and I am not leaving this building without him." Deputy Bates slid the temporary custody form across the counter without a word. The pen felt heavier than any contract I had ever signed in 40 years of cattle business, because this time I was not buying land. I was claiming a child nobody else in the world seemed to want. I signed my name, set the pen down, and looked at Bates. He exhaled like a man who had been holding his breath for an hour. "CPS would have been here by 6, he said. "You just saved us both a long night." Buzzed me through the door to the room where the boy sat. I opened it slowly, the way you open a gate when there is a spooked horse on the other side. The child's eyes locked onto me, and his whole body went rigid. Shoulders up, chin down, hands gripping the edges of the metal chair. I stopped 3 feet away and knelt on one knee so my face was level with his. "You're coming home with me," I said, keeping my voice as low and steady as I could manage. "Nobody is going to hurt you tonight." I didn't answer. He didn't nod. But when I took my canvas ranch jacket off and draped it over his trembling shoulders, he flinched once and then went still. Not relaxed, just still. The way a child goes still when he has learned that stillness is safer than moving. I lifted him off the chair. He weighed almost nothing. His arms hung at his sides and his bare feet dangled against my hip. I carried him across the parking lot in the rain, with one arm under his legs and one hand cupping the back of his head, and I had carried newborn calves through blizzards and never once hesitated. But carrying this boy, I felt like I was holding something so fragile the whole world might shatter if I gripped too hard. I set him in the passenger seat of the truck and buckled the belt around him. He pulled his knees to his chest immediately, wrapped my jacket tighter, and stared straight ahead through the rain-streaked windshield. He had not spoken a single word since I walked into that room. The drive home took nearly an hour. The storm had flooded 2 low crossings on the county road, and I had to take the long way around through Chalk Mountain. The wipers beat their steady rhythm. The heater blew warm air across the cab. The boy sat motionless beside me, his face lit in flashes by the passing road lamps. That was when I saw it clearly. Under the yellow glow of a lamp near the Paluxy River Bridge, his mouth caught the light at just the right angle. The overbite, the same slight forward press of the upper front teeth that Colton had. Not similar, identical. The same hereditary trait the dentist had pointed out 2 years ago. The kind of thing you don't pick up from environment. The kind of thing that lives in the bone. I gripped the steering wheel and kept driving. At the ranch, Darlene met me at the door. She looked at the boy in my arms, then at my face, and asked nothing. She went home. I carried the child through the dark house to the bathroom and set him on the edge of the tub. I ran warm water, laid out a clean towel, and a pair of Colton's pajamas, the blue ones with the snaps, and stepped into the hallway to give him privacy. He washed himself without help. I heard the water move in small, careful splashes, the sound of a child who had learned to be quiet even in a bathtub. When he came out, the pajamas fit him perfectly, of course they did. He was exactly the same size as Colton, down to the way the cuffs hit his wrists. I led him to the guest bedroom at the end of the hall. The sheet smelled like cedar from the linen closet. I pulled back the quilt, and he climbed in and curled onto his side without looking at me. I tucked the covers around his shoulders the way I had tucked Colton in 1,000 times, and he let me. His eyes were open, staring at the wall. I don't think he knew how to close them with a stranger in the room. "You're safe here," I told him from the doorway. I don't know if he believed me. I pulled his door shut and walked 4 steps down the hall to Colton's room. I opened the door as quietly as I could. Colton was exactly where I had left him, tangled in his patchwork quilt, left hand curled under his chin, breathing slow and deep. The same face I had just tucked in at the other end of the hallway. The same hands. The same slight whistle through the nose when he exhaled. How do you stand between two doors, each holding a child with the same face, and decide which one is the stranger? You don't. You stand there with your boots still damp and your heart beating too fast, and you listen to two boys breathing in separate rooms with the same rhythm and the same depth, and you realize that everything you thought you knew about your family might be wrong. I leaned against the hallway wall and closed my eyes. One boy I had raised for 4 years. One boy I had carried out of a sheriff's station an hour ago. Same face, same hands, same blood maybe. 2 boys under one roof, and I did not know which one was truly mine, or whether it even mattered anymore. I didn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen chair until the sky turned gray and then pink, and when the sun finally hit the window, I got up and made scrambled eggs, because that is what you do when 2 boys are sleeping under your roof and the world no longer makes sense. Colton shuffled in at 7, rubbing his eyes with his fists the way he always did. 9 years old, sandy hair sticking up on one side, barefoot on the cool tile. He climbed into his chair and picked up his fork before the plate was even in front of him. He had no idea that a child with his exact face had slept 10 feet away all night. The rescued boy was still behind the guest room door, silent as a held breath. "Grandpa," Colton said through a mouthful of eggs, "remember the first day I came here? The big red door on the barn scared me 'cause I thought it was on fire." I set my coffee down slowly. "That door has been blue since before you were born, buddy." "Nuh-uh," he said, shrugging. "It was red, I remember." I went back to his eggs like it was nothing. But it was not nothing. I had painted that barn door blue in the summer of 2019, 2 full years before Garrett brought the boy to my porch. If Colton arrived when he was 5 in the fall of 2021, the door was already blue. He could not have seen it red. Not if the story I had been told was true. Children forget birthdays and homework assignments. But they do not invent the color of a barn door they saw on the most frightening day of their lives. That memory was real, which meant the timeline I had been given was not. I cleared the plates and said nothing. I checked on the guest room. The rescued boy was sitting on the edge of the bed in Colton's pajamas, staring at his own hands. I brought him toast and a glass of milk and set both on the nightstand. He did not look at me, but when I closed the door I heard the toast being picked up before my boots reached the hallway. At noon, the crunch of gravel on the ranch drive pulled me to the front window. A black luxury sedan was tearing up the road fast enough to throw dust 20 feet behind it. I knew the car before I saw the driver. My son always did prefer things that looked expensive and moved fast. Garrett stepped out first. He had not aged well, 42 years old with the tight jaw and hollow eyes of a man who runs from everything, including sleep. He did not look at the house. He looked at the barn, the fence line, the property, the way a man appraises something he plans to take. Jolene Caldwell, his 39-year-old wife, a woman who measured human worth by zip codes and had never once sent Colton a birthday card, stepped out of the passenger side without bothering to say hello. Her heels sank into the mud, and she didn't seem to notice. Her eyes went straight to the kitchen window. 4 years of silence, and my son did not walk through the door asking about his own child. He walked through demanding I get rid of someone else's. "Dad," Garrett said from the bottom of the porch steps, not coming up, "we heard the county called you about some stray kid on the highway. You can't just take in some random child. Call Seifs and let them handle it. This isn't your problem." I leaned against the porch railing with my coffee mug in my hand and my face arranged into the expression of a tired old rancher who was too simple to ask hard questions. I had learned a long time ago that the best way to get Garrett to reveal himself was to let him think he was the smartest person in the room. "Just trying to do the right thing," I said. Boy had nowhere to go. "Well, he's not your responsibility. There are systems for this." Jolene had not moved from the car. She was staring through the kitchen window with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not anger, not annoyance, but raw, unfiltered terror. The rescued boy must have wandered into the kitchen. Jolene's hand went to her mouth. "Get that child out of this house," she said, her voice cracking. "Now." I watched her carefully. A woman who had never shown concern for the grandson sleeping under my roof for 4 years was now shaken at the sight of a boy she claimed was a stranger. That reaction was not confusion. That was recognition. That was a woman staring at something she thought she had gotten rid of. Garrett grabbed her elbow and steered her back to the car. He turned to me one last time from the driver's door. "Stay out of things that aren't your business, old man," he said. Not dad, not father, old man. I watched their sedan fishtail down the muddy drive and disappear behind the tree line. My son had come and gone like a brush fire, fast, destructive, and leaving nothing but scorched ground behind. He had not asked about Colton. He had not asked to see the boy he left on my porch 4 years ago. He had driven 45 minutes to tell me to throw away a child, and his wife had looked at that child like she was staring at a ghost she had personally buried. Whatever they were hiding, it was not a county mix-up. It was something they had planned, and I was done playing the fool. After Garrett and Jolene tore out of my driveway that afternoon, I spent the rest of the day watching both boys and saying nothing. I fed them supper. I read Colton his chapter. I checked on the rescued boy who had eaten every crumb I brought him but still hadn't spoken a word. And when the house finally went dark and quiet, I sat at the kitchen table and let my mind do what it had been trying to do all day. That was when I remembered the cameras. 4 weatherproof units, bolted to the barn rafters. The same autumn Garrett had shown up with a child and a story. I had installed them to catch the cattle thieves who had been cutting fence wire along the south pasture. Each camera fed into a recording system that wrote continuously to an external hard drive stored in the old desktop computer in my barn office. I had checked the footage a few times that first year, saw nothing but empty driveway and grazing cattle, and eventually forgot the system existed. But the hard drive hadn't forgotten. If it was still running, it had been recording everything for 4 years straight. Every truck that came down my road, every visitor, every arrival and departure, including the night Garrett and Jolene pulled up in a rental car with a 5-year-old boy in the back seat. I put those cameras up to watch for men stealing calves. I never imagined they might have recorded my own son stealing something far worse. I pulled on my boots and crossed the yard to the barn. The office was a small room at the back, behind the tack wall, with a plywood door I hadn't opened in months. The air inside smelled like dust and motor oil and cedar shavings from the workbench. I hit the light switch and the single bulb flickered twice before catching. The desktop sat on a rough wooden desk in the corner, its tower coated in a fine layer of grit, the hard drive light blinking green, still running, still recording. I have repaired broken fence posts in the dark with nothing but a flashlight and instinct. But sitting down at that desk and reaching for that gritty keyboard felt like stepping into a courtroom where I was both the judge and the accused. Because whatever was on that drive, I had let it sit there for 4 years without looking. The system was simple. Folders organized by date, each containing 24 hours of footage split into 1-hour segments. I scrolled back through the archive, month by month, year by year, until I reached the fall 4 years ago. I found the date, the night Garrett arrived. I clicked on the first file from that evening. The footage played, clear, sharp, well lit by the motion-activated barn lamp. Empty driveway at 8 p.m. A possum crossing the gravel at 8:47. The pasture gate swinging in the wind at 9:15, crystal clear. Then I opened the file stamped 10 p.m. to 11:30 p.m., the window when Garrett would have arrived. Static. Not the kind of static you get from a loose wire. The kind you get from data that has been damaged at the source. The image stuttered and tore, flashing between gray noise and brief, broken frames. In one fragment, I caught 2 figures standing beside what looked like a vehicle. In another, a blurred shape, small, low to the ground, being carried, moved across the frame. But no faces, no license plate, no detail sharp enough to prove anything. The footage on either side of that window was flawless. Hours of empty driveway, perfectly recorded. But the exact 90 minutes I needed were shattered into static and shadows. That was not an accident. Someone had accessed this system and tried to destroy the evidence. They had mostly succeeded, but mostly is not completely. I played the corrupted segment again, and again. I leaned so close to the monitor that the blue light burned my eyes. 2 people beside a car. A small shape being carried through what looked like rain. The outline of the porch railing in the background. I could see the shape of the truth, but I could not read its face. I sat back in the chair and pressed my palms against my eyes. The coyotes were calling somewhere past the south fence. The wind pushed against the barn walls in slow, heavy gusts. The hard drive clicked and whirred under the desk, cycling through its endless loop of recording and storing, indifferent to what it held. Ruth Ann would have known what to do. She had a way of looking at broken things and seeing exactly where the fracture started. A cracked beam, a split hoof, a son going wrong. She would have sat in this chair and found the answer in 10 minutes. I was still learning how to ask the right questions. But I knew one thing. That footage was not gone. It was damaged, corrupted, maybe deliberately sabotaged, but the data was still on that drive. The shadows were still in there, the faces were still in there, and somewhere in this state, there was a person who could crack open a dead file and pull the evidence out whole. I powered down the monitor, but left the hard drive running. I walked back across the dark yard to the house, checked both bedroom doors, and stood in the hallway one more time. 2 boys breathing, 2 mysteries, and a hard drive in my barn that held the truth trapped under 90 minutes of static like a body frozen under ice. I couldn't fix the hard drive myself. I knew that much by morning. But while I waited to figure out who could, there was something else I could do. Something that didn't require a technician or a trip to town. Just a step stool and the nerve to look at what I had been ignoring for 4 years. The shoebox was on the top shelf of the hall closet, behind a folded quilt and a stack of Ruth Ann's old hymnals. I pulled it down and carried it to the kitchen table. Inside were dozens of photographs, every picture I had taken of Colton since the night Garrett brought him to my door. Birthday cakes, first day of school, standing next to the fence holding a stick like a fishing rod. The ordinary moments of a childhood I had believed was my grandson's. I spread them across the pine table and found the earliest one. Colton, at age 5, standing on my front porch in a blue windbreaker, the morning after he arrived. His eyes were wide and uncertain, his hands hanging at his sides like he didn't know what to do with them. I had taken the photo because I wanted to remember the beginning. Now I studied it like a detective. There is a specific kind of cruelty in photographs. They show you exactly what was there, not what you wanted to see. And I had spent 4 years looking at this picture and seeing my grandson, seeing Ruth Ann's chin, my own brow, the Caldwell jaw. Now, with the rescued boy sleeping down the hall and Garrett's cold voice still echoing in my memory, I was looking at it for the first time without the story Garrett had wrapped around it. I set the photograph aside and went to my desk in the study. In the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of insurance papers and old tax returns, I found the pediatric health file Garrett had left behind when he dropped off the boy. A thin manila folder with the child's early medical records, vaccinations, baby checkups, growth charts. I had kept it the way I kept everything important, filed and forgotten. I opened the folder and read through it slowly. The records documented a healthy boy born at Hendrick Medical Center in Abilene, standard vaccinations on schedule. And there, on the second page, a notation I had never paid attention to before. BCG vaccination administered at 3 months, left upper arm. Expected scar, small, round, slightly raised. I picked up the photograph again. The blue windbreaker had short sleeves. The boy's left arm was clearly visible from the shoulder to the elbow, smooth and pale in the morning light. I looked at every inch of that arm. There was no scar. I held the medical file in one hand and the photograph in the other. The file said the scar existed. The photograph said it did not. 4 years of love stood balanced on the head of a pin. I went through every other photo in the box. Summer pictures, swimming at the stock tank, shirtless afternoons chasing the barn cat through the yard. In every picture where Colton's left arm was visible, the skin was smooth, unmarked. No round raised circle, no trace of any vaccination scar at all. The coffee on the counter had gone cold. The kitchen clock ticked loud in the silence. I set the photos down and sat very still, trying to find another explanation. Maybe the scar faded. Maybe the record was wrong. Maybe the vaccination had been given on the other arm and the nurse wrote it down incorrectly. But I knew better. BCG scars don't vanish. They are permanent, visible, distinctive. And medical records at a hospital like Hendrick are not written by nurses guessing. They are charted by professionals. The file said left upper arm. The arm said nothing was there. I stood up from the table and walked down the hallway to Colton's room. He was still asleep. It was barely 7, a Saturday morning, and 9-year-old boys sleep like the dead on Saturdays. I turned the doorknob slowly, eased the door open, and stepped inside. How do you stand over a sleeping child you have tucked in every night for 4 years and ask yourself whether he is yours? You do it the same way you do everything that might destroy you, slowly and with your hands shaken. Colton was on his side, his left arm stretched out across the pillow. I could see the skin from his shoulder to his wrist in the gray morning light coming through the curtain. I leaned closer. I looked at every inch of that arm the way I had looked at the photograph. Smooth, unmarked, no scar, not now and not ever. "Who are you, son?" I whispered. "Who did they bring to me?" I didn't stir. His breathing stayed slow and steady, the same rhythm I had listened to through this door 1,000 times. The same boy, the same face, the same child I loved more than my own comfort. But the medical file in my hand described a different child entirely. One who had a scar on his left arm. One who had been vaccinated at Hendrick Medical Center. One who was my biological grandson. I pulled the bedroom door shut with trembling fingers and leaned my forehead against the hallway wall. The scar was not there. It had never been there. The boy sleeping in that bed was not the boy described in that medical file. My son had placed a stranger's child in my home and called him family. That was when I could no longer pretend I didn't know. The missing scar had given me suspicion. But suspicion is not proof. Proof requires a man with a medical degree and the original records, and so the next afternoon I tucked the pediatric file into a feed store bag, left both boys with Darlene, and drove to Stephenville. Dr. Ray Hadley had been the only pediatrician in town for 30 years. A tall, soft-spoken man in his late 60s with reading glasses perpetually pushed up on his forehead. He had delivered half the babies in Erath County and vaccinated most of the other half. He had treated my grandson, my real grandson, from birth through the 18-month checkup. After that, Garrett had stopped bringing the child in. I never thought to ask why. I sat in the waiting room surrounded by faded ranch magazines and the antiseptic smell of a place that has never changed its floor wax, and when the nurse called me back, I walked into Hadley's office, carrying the feed store bag like it contained something explosive. It did. "Ray," I said, setting the file on his desk, "I need you to compare this against whatever you have in your system. These are the records Garrett left with me when he brought the boy to the ranch." Hadley opened the file, scanned the first page, then turned to his computer and pulled up the original chart. He read in silence for a long time, his eyes moving between the screen and the papers on his desk. Then he took off his glasses and looked at me the way a man looks at a friend when he is about to deliver news that will change everything. "The vaccination records match what I have," he said. "BCG at 3 months, left upper arm. I administered it myself, and the blood type on file is B positive. And if the boy at my house doesn't have that scar?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Then he's not the same child, Virgil. It's that simple. You want to know what it feels like to sit across from a man who has known your family for 40 years and watch him tell you your grandson is not your grandson. It feels like the floor is still under your feet, but the ground isn't. Everything looks the same. The desk, the diplomas on the wall, the jar of lollipops for children. But none of it means what it meant 5 minutes ago." Hadley leaned forward. "There's more," he said quietly. "The blood type. B positive is not common. If the child living with you has a different blood type, and I suspect he does, then there is 0 chance of a biological match. Not unlikely. 0. I thanked him. I stood up. I shook his hand the way I always did. Firm, 2 pumps, eye contact, and I walked out of that office into the October sunlight feeling like a man who had just been told the house he built was sitting on someone else's land. I could have driven home angry. I could have driven home broken. Instead, I stopped at the grocery store on the way out of town and bought the chocolate milk Colton liked, the kind with the cow on the label, because it was Tuesday, and on Tuesdays I always brought him chocolate milk. I stood in the dairy aisle holding that carton and thought about what Hadley had said, and I put it in the basket and paid for it and drove home with it sweating in the passenger seat. Because whatever a blood test said, Tuesday was still Tuesday, and Colton was still the boy who expected chocolate milk. That evening I made supper, grilled cheese and tomato soup, his favorite. The rescued boy ate in the guest room. He still hadn't spoken. Colton sat across from me at the kitchen table with his feet swinging off the chair, telling me about a turtle he had seen by the stock tank. I listened to every word. I watched his face. I memorized it the way you memorize something you're afraid of losing. After supper, I walked him to his room and pulled back the covers. He climbed in and looked up at me. "Grandpa, tell the one about the 2 cowboys who got lost in the canyon." I sat on the edge of his bed and told it. The same story I had told 100 times. Two cowboys separated by a rock slide who find each other by following the sound of each other's whistling. Colton's eyes got heavy around the part where the first cowboy hears the echo. By the time the second cowboy rounds the bend, he was asleep. What makes a grandchild yours? Is it the blood? Is it the name on a birth certificate locked in a courthouse drawer? Or is it 4 years of Tuesday chocolate milk and Canyon cowboy stories and a small hand reaching for yours in a parking lot? I brushed the hair off his forehead. His breathing was slow and deep, the slight whistle through his nose that I knew better than my own heartbeat. He called me Grandpa the way he always did, like it was the truest word he knew. And maybe it was. No matter who you are, I whispered, you are still my grandson. I pulled his blanket up to his chin and stood in the doorway for a long time. The doctor had given me proof. The photographs had given me proof. The records had given me proof. But none of that changed the fact that this boy was mine. What it changed was simpler and worse. It meant somewhere out there, another boy who was also mine had been living a life I knew nothing about. I spent that night sitting in the dark with the knowledge that my real grandson was out there somewhere, living a life I had never been told about. By morning, I had no plan, no lead, and no idea where to start looking. Then the phone rang. 7 o'clock, a 940 area code I didn't recognize. I answered the way I always do, last name, nothing else. Mr. Caldwell, the woman said. Her voice was careful, measured, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this call in her head before dialing. You don't know me, but I know your grandson, the real one. The kitchen went sideways. I gripped the counter with my free hand and stared at the morning light cutting through the window above the sink. Nobody had said those two words to me before, the real one, and hearing them out loud from a stranger's mouth made everything I had been piecing together in silence suddenly, horribly concrete. Who is this? I said. My name is Lorraine Poole. I live in Mineral Wells. I need to meet with you today, Mr. Caldwell, in person. There are things you need to know, and I can't say them over the phone. She asked me to meet her at Hardcastle's Diner on the east side of Stephenville at 2 o'clock. I agreed, not because I trusted her, but because she had used the word grandson, the way someone uses it when they have been carrying the weight of it alone for a very long time. You think you know what betrayal sounds like. You think it sounds like a door slamming or a lie caught in daylight. It doesn't. It sounds like a stranger on a Tuesday morning saying your grandson's name more gently than your own son ever did. I left both boys with Darlene and drove to Stephenville. Hardcastle's was the kind of diner that hadn't changed its menu or its carpet since 1987. Red vinyl booths, laminate tables, the smell of fried onions and coffee that had been sitting on the burner since dawn. I took a booth near the back where nobody would hear us over the clatter of plates. Lorraine Poole walked in at 2 on the dot. She was 58 years old, a retired home care aide with worn hands and a face that looked like it had been tired for years. She sat down across from me, ordered nothing, and folded her hands on the table. I've been raising a boy, she said, for 4 years. His name is Wyatt. Your son and his wife brought him to me when he was about 5 years old. They told me his mama couldn't handle him. They paid me $1,500 a month to keep him quiet and out of sight. I felt the blood leave my face. Out of sight of who? Of you, Mr. Caldwell. She said it without flinching. She said it the way you say something you have been carrying for so long it has worn a groove in your chest. And then she kept talking. $1,500 a month. Deposited into her checking account like clockwork on the first of every month for 4 years. She never met any other family members. She never asked questions because the money was steady and the boy needed someone, and she told herself that was enough. She enrolled him in school under the name Wyatt. She took him to the doctor when he was sick. She read to him at night. She did everything a grandmother or a mother would do, except she was neither. She was a hired stranger in a rented house 60 miles from the ranch where the boy should have been living all along. $1,500 a month for 4 years. I did the math in my head without wanting to. $72,000 to make a child disappear. Not into the ground, but into a life so small and so quiet that nobody would ever think to look for him there. 3 months ago, the payment stopped, Lorraine said. Her voice dropped. I called your son. He told me to keep quiet and he would handle it. He didn't handle it. I've been covering the boy's expenses out of my own savings since July. I can't do it much longer, Mr. Caldwell, and I didn't know who else to call. What kind of man pays a stranger to raise his own father's grandson in a town just far enough away that the old man would never stumble across him at a gas station? The kind of man who sees children as line items. The kind of man Ruth Ann had warned me about on her last night alive. Lorraine reached into her purse and pulled out a photograph. A school photo, the kind with the blue background and the forced smile. She slid it across the laminate table and I looked down at it. The boy in the picture had my jaw. He had Ruth Ann's eyes. That specific shade of gray-green that I had not seen on a living face since the day she closed hers. And he had a smile that hit me so hard I had to press my forearms against the table edge to keep my hands from shaking. They stopped paying me 3 months ago, Lorraine said again, quieter this time. I didn't know what to do with the boy. The way she said, do with him. Like he was a package that needed forwarding, a problem that needed solving, made something inside me go very still and very dangerous. Because that boy was not a package, he was not a problem, he was my blood, and he had been 60 miles away for 4 years while I read bedtime stories to a stranger's child and called him grandson. I set the school photo flat on the diner table between us and asked Lorraine the only question that mattered more than who. I asked her how a 9-year-old boy ended up walking alone on a state highway in a thunderstorm. She twisted a paper napkin between her fingers and looked past me at the rain-streaked window. When the payments stopped, she said, I called your son. First time I dialed his number in almost a year. He picked up and told me to keep quiet, said he would handle it. That was July. By September, he'd stopped answering altogether. I was pulling from my savings to cover groceries and school supplies, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep it up. She paused. The diner bell rang as someone came through the front door. She waited until it was quiet again. 2 nights ago, I was on the phone with my sister. I was telling her I might have to send the boy back to his father, back to someone, I didn't even know who. I thought Wyatt was in bed. He wasn't. He was standing in the hallway listening. Her voice dropped to nearly nothing. He heard the word back. He didn't know where back was, he just knew he didn't want to go. A 9-year-old boy ran barefoot into a thunderstorm, because the word back was the most terrifying thing he had ever heard. And if that doesn't tell you everything about the life my son built for him, nothing will. Lorraine kept going. She said Wyatt had slipped out through the side door while she was still on the phone. She didn't notice for 20 minutes. When she realized the boy was gone, she drove every road between Mineral Wells and Granbury in the rain, checking gas stations and overpasses and ditches. By the time she thought to try the highway, the deputy had already picked him up. I drove to the station, she said. They told me a family member had already taken custody. I didn't know it was you until I saw the name on the intake form. That's when I decided to call. I sat there in that vinyl booth with the smell of cold coffee and fried onions hanging in the air and the untouched slice of pie the waitress had brought pushed to the edge of the table. I looked at the school photo again. Ruth Ann's eyes, my jaw. A boy I should have known for 9 years and had never once laid eyes on. "You did the right thing telling me," I told her. My voice was steadier than it had any right to be. She nodded once, quick, and then she said something that stopped me. "I never stopped caring for him, Mr. Caldwell. I want you to know that. Whatever else I did wrong, and I know I did wrong, that boy was fed and he was read to and he was loved." I believed her. I hated the arrangement, but I believed the woman. I drove home through the last of the afternoon light with the school photo on the passenger seat and a weight in my chest that felt like a cinder block tied to a rope. When I got to the ranch, both boys were in the kitchen with Darlene. Colton doing homework, the rescued boy sitting at the far end of the table drawing circles on a piece of scratch paper with a pencil. I looked at the rescued boy, and for the first time I didn't see a mystery. I saw Wyatt, my grandson, the one who had been hidden in a rented house while I slept 60 miles away. After supper, after both boys were in bed, I went to the study and opened the filing cabinet. Some filing cabinets hold tax returns and old warranties. Mine held a paper trail to the worst thing my son ever did, and I had been sitting 3 feet from it every evening for 4 years. I found it in the second drawer. A loan guarantee form dated 4 years ago, the fall before Garrett brought the boy to my porch. $85,000 he had asked me to co-sign. I remembered the phone call, his voice tight, his words clipped, the sound of a man who needed money badly enough to ask his father, but not badly enough to tell him why. I had refused. I told him I didn't sign loans I didn't understand, and he had hung up without saying goodbye. The loan was dated 6 days before the swap. 6 days. He asked me for the money on a Tuesday. I said no. And by the following Monday, my grandson was living in a stranger's house in Mineral Wells, and a different child was sleeping in my guest room. $85,000. That was the number my son put on 2 children's lives, and he hadn't even gotten the loan. He had found another way. Care subsidies, my household spending, the money I poured into raising a child I believed was mine. The scheme didn't need the loan. The scheme was the loan. I sat at my desk with the loan paper in one hand and Lorraine's school photo in the other. The boy in the photo, the dates on the paper, the payments to a stranger. Every piece pointed the same direction, and that direction was a hard drive wrapped in a dish towel on my kitchen counter that I still hadn't been able to crack open. My son didn't lose me over money. He sold both grandchildren for it. Every piece of evidence I had gathered pointed at the same locked door, the corrupted hard drive sitting on my kitchen counter. The bank papers, the doctor's records, Lorraine's testimony, all of it was circumstance. The footage was proof, and I couldn't open it alone. I wrapped the drive in a dish towel the next morning, set it on the pass, and drove to Granbury before I could change my mind. Nolan Redmond ran a data recovery and electronics repair shop out of a converted feed barn on the east side of town. He was 61 years old, a former IT contractor who had traded Dallas cubicles for soldering irons in small-town quiet 15 years ago. I had known him since he rewired my barn's electrical panel during the drought of 2018. He was the only person within 100 miles I trusted with something like this. His workshop smelled like solder flux and old capacitors. Circuit boards and gutted hard drives covered every bench. A green LED blinked on a diagnostic rig in the corner. Nolan rolled his stool across the concrete floor. When I walked in and looked at the dish towel in my hands, the way a surgeon looks at what you bring into the emergency room. This drive has footage from my ranch cameras, I told him. 4 years old. I need to see what's on it, and I need it done quiet. He unwrapped the towel, turned the drive over in his hands, and plugged it into his diagnostic cradle. The machine clicked and hummed. He watched the screen for a long time, scrolling through data I couldn't read, before he leaned back and took off his glasses. "The platters aren't scratched," he said. "That's the good news. The data's probably still on here, but the file system is shot. Not degraded, Virgil. Wiped. Somebody ran a deletion pass on this drive. They didn't finish the job, but they got far enough to scramble the directory." Handing that drive to Nolan felt like sliding the last bullet into a chamber. Once it was loaded, there was no putting it back. The only question left was where you aimed. "Can you recover it?" I asked. "Maybe, probably, but I have to rebuild the file table sector by sector. It's not fast work." He set the drive carefully on a padded mat next to his rig. 3 days. Give me 3 days. I nodded. I shook his hand. I walked out of that workshop into the October sun and stood in the gravel parking lot for a full minute before I could make my legs carry me to the truck. Someone, and I knew exactly who, had tried to destroy the evidence on that drive. They had gone into my barn, accessed my system, and attempted to erase the footage of their own crime. The corruption I had seen wasn't age or accident. It was sabotage. I drove home the long way, through the back roads south of Granbury, because I wasn't ready to face the house yet. The truck rattled over cattle guards and cracked asphalt, and I kept both hands on the wheel and my eyes on the road and my mind on the calendar. 3 days. 72 hours. I had built barns in less time, but I had never waited for anything that mattered this much. You ever sit in a parked truck on the shoulder of a highway and realize that the worst night of a child's life happened right where your tires are sitting? I have. I don't recommend it. I didn't plan to stop. But when I came around the bend near the Highway 377 turnoff, something pulled at me. A weight in the chest, a gravity I couldn't explain, and I eased the truck onto the gravel shoulder and killed the engine. This was the stretch. This was where the deputy had found Wyatt walking barefoot in the rain 9 days ago. The asphalt was dry now, the ditch full of yellow grass, the sky going orange through the windshield. An ordinary piece of highway, nothing to mark it, no sign, no memorial, no indication that a 9-year-old boy had walked this shoulder in a thunderstorm, trying to reach a home he had never been allowed to know existed. I stepped out of the truck and stood on the gravel. The evening air smelled like cut grass and the distant promise of rain. A cattle truck passed doing 60, and the wind from it pushed against my jacket. Then it was quiet again. Just the road, the fence posts, and the memory of a boy I was only beginning to understand I had failed. I had the bank papers, I had Lorraine's testimony, I had the doctor's records, I had the school photo with Ruth Ann's eyes looking back at me. But none of that showed the moment it happened. The moment one boy was carried out of a car in the rain and placed in my home while another was driven away into a life of hiding. Only the footage could show that, and the footage was spinning inside a machine in Nolan's workshop, corrupted by the same hands that committed the crime. 3 days is nothing when you are building a fence. 3 days is everything when you are waiting to see whether a machine can prove your son is a criminal. I sat on that highway shoulder until the sun dropped behind the tree line. Then I drove home, checked both bedroom doors, and began the longest wait of my life. The first day of the wait passed in silence. Wyatt's silence mostly. He sat where I put him, ate what I gave him, and watched everything with the careful, cataloging eyes of a child who has learned that new places are dangerous until proven otherwise. I didn't push. I just kept the coffee coming and stayed on the porch where he could see me. On the second morning, he spoke, not to me, to the barn cat, a big orange Tom that had climbed onto the porch railing and was sitting there cleaning his paw like he owned the place. Wyatt was standing 3 feet away with his hands at his sides, and without looking at me, he said, very quietly, "Hey, you're orange." 2 words. The first I had heard from him since the night the deputy pulled him off the highway. I set my coffee on the railing and said nothing because I understood that whatever door had just cracked open would slam shut if I moved too fast. Over the next 2 days, the words came in fragments. He named the barn cat Juice. He asked about the horses in the south pasture. He ate 3 peanut butter sandwiches cut into triangles for lunch, and when I asked if he wanted a fourth, he shook his head and almost smiled. Almost. On the second evening, he was sitting at the kitchen table drawing circles on scratch paper when he looked up at me and said something that nearly put me on the floor. "The woman told me my real family didn't want me. Is that true? How do you explain to a 9-year-old boy that he wasn't unwanted? He was hidden. That the family he was told didn't care about him had been 60 miles away the whole time, looking at a different boy and calling him by the wrong name? You don't. Not yet. Not until you can say it without your voice breaking." "That is not true," I told him. "Not even close." He looked at me for a long time. Then he asked the question I had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. "Are you my grandpa?" I knelt down beside his chair so my eyes were level with his. I put my hand on the table next to his, not touching, just close, and I said the only honest thing I could. "I am now." He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just nodded once, the way a child nods when something he has been carrying for a very long time gets set down in a place that feels safe. Then he went back to drawing his circles, and I went back to the counter and gripped the edge of it until my knuckles turned white, because I could not let him see what was happening to my face. The next afternoon, I introduced him to Colton. I didn't explain. I didn't prepare a speech. I just said, "Colton, this is Wyatt. He's going to be staying with us for a while." Colton looked at Wyatt. Wyatt looked at Colton. 2 boys with the same face staring at each other across my kitchen table like 2 mirrors set at slightly different angles. I held my breath. "You want to see the creek?" Colton said. "There's crawdads if you know where to look." 2 boys chasing each other through a pasture on an October afternoon. It should have been the most ordinary thing in the world. But nothing about it was ordinary, because one of them had been stolen and the other had been borrowed, and the man watching from the fence loved them both exactly the same. They ran through the tall grass toward the creek at the bottom of the south pasture. I could hear Colton's easy laughter carrying across the field, and then, for the first time, I heard Wyatt laugh. A real laugh, not polite, not careful, but the full, breathless sound of a child who has forgotten, for just a moment, that the world has been unkind to him. I leaned against the fence post and watched them splash through the shallow water, flipping rocks looking for crawdads, shoving each other and shrieking when the cold hit their ankles. They didn't know they were supposed to be each other. They didn't know one had been traded for the other. They just knew there was another boy their age in a creek full of mud, and that was enough. Children don't need paperwork to know who belongs to them. They need a creek, a handful of crawdads, and someone willing to get muddy. And in about 45 minutes, those 2 boys had built something my son had spent 4 years trying to destroy. They came running up to the fence together around 4 o'clock, out of breath and covered in creek mud from their boots to their ears. They grabbed the top rail side by side, grinning, and Colton said, "Grandpa, he caught one, a big one." I looked at their hands on the fence rail. 2 small sets of muddy fingers gripping the wood, and on both left hands, the same small callus from gripping a fence rail, the same way I'd taught them both. Not blood, just years of the same hands doing the same things. I was still staring at those 2 hands when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. Nolan Redmond's name lit up the screen. I looked at the 2 boys. I looked at the phone. And the joy I had been holding in my chest for the last hour went cold. I answered the phone with 2 muddy boys grinning up at me from the fence rail. Nolan's voice was tight. "I got it. 17 minutes. You need to come now." I told the boys to go wash up. I crossed the yard to Darlene Gentry's cottage. She was the ranch foreman's wife, a sturdy woman in her 50s who had watched over neighbor children in Stephenville for as long as anyone could remember, and asked her to stay with them until I got back. Then I drove to Granbury, doing 9 miles over the speed limit the entire way. Nolan's workshop was dim when I walked in. He had pulled the blinds and turned off the overhead fluorescents, leaving only the blue glow of the recovery monitor and a desk lamp angled away from the screen. He was standing beside his rig with his arms crossed and a look on his face I had never seen before. Not professional concern, but something closer to grief. "Sit down," he said. I sat on the metal stool beside his workbench. He clicked play. The footage was grainy, shot through rain. The timestamp reading 2:14 a.m. from a night 4 years ago. The camera angle showed the ranch gate and the first 30 feet of the driveway. A car pulled up, headlights cutting through the downpour, and stopped just outside the gate. The driver's door opened. A man stepped out. My son. Garrett walked to the gate, unlatched it, and swung it open. Then he stopped. He looked left down the road. He looked right. The way a man looks when he knows what he is doing is wrong and wants to make sure nobody is watching. You think you want to see the truth. You think seeing it will make it real in a way that paper and photographs and a stranger's testimony cannot. But when the truth is your own son opening a gate at 2 in the morning for a crime he helped plan, seeing it doesn't make it real. It makes everything before it feel like a lie. The passenger door opened. Jolene stepped out and went to the back seat. She leaned in and emerged carrying a small shape, a child wrapped in a blanket, limp with sleep. She cradled the boy against her shoulder and walked through the gate, past Garrett, up the driveway toward the front porch. Garrett closed the gate behind her, checked the road one more time, and followed. The footage continued for another 11 minutes. It showed them entering the house. It showed Garrett returning to the car alone, opening the trunk, pulling out a duffel bag. It showed him walking back inside. At 2:31 a.m., the porch light went off and the driveway was empty again. 17 minutes. The entire crime captured in 17 minutes of rain-streaked footage that my son had tried to erase and failed. "I'm sorry, Virgil," Nolan said quietly. His chair creaked as he leaned back. "I wish I hadn't found it." "Play it again," I said. "Play it again." 2 words I never thought I would say about the worst moment of my life. But I needed to be sure, and being sure meant watching my son betray me twice. The second time through, I saw what I had missed. When Jolene carried the child from the car, she was not just holding him, she was whispering to him. Her lips were moving against the boy's hair, and her hand was stroking the back of his head in a slow, rhythmic motion, the kind of gesture you see from a mother soothing a baby through a nightmare. She had done this before. She had practiced it. Maybe on the drive over, maybe in the days before. She knew exactly how to keep the child asleep while she carried him through the rain and into a stranger's house. That was worse than the act itself. The act could have been desperation. A bad decision made in a bad moment by people out of options. But the whispering, the stroking, the rehearsed tenderness, that was planning. That was a crime with a lullaby. Nolan copied the footage to a flash drive and handed it to me. I put it in my shirt pocket and buttoned the flap. He offered me a bottle of water. I didn't take it. My mouth was too dry to swallow anyway. I thanked him. I shook his hand. And I walked out of that workshop into the October night and drove home in total silence. No radio, no window cracked, no sound except the tires on the asphalt and my own breathing, because I did not trust what would come out of my mouth if I opened it. I drove 45 minutes through the dark with 17 minutes of footage pressed against my chest like a second heartbeat. I had seen my son open a gate for his wife to carry a stranger's child into my home. I had seen him check the road like a lookout. I had seen her whisper a lullaby to the boy she was using as a prop in a scheme to steal from his own father. I had the what now. I had the when. I had the who. I had the how. I had bank papers and medical records and a caretaker's testimony and 17 minutes of video that no lawyer could argue away. I pulled into the ranch driveway, killed the engine, and sat in the dark cab. The flash drive sat warm against my chest. I had everything I needed except one thing. Why? Now I needed to know why. The why was waiting for me on my own desk. I just hadn't known how to read it until now. I didn't sleep that night. I went straight to the study, turned on the desk lamp, and spread every piece of paper I had across the pine surface like a man laying out a hand of cards he already knew he'd lost. The loan application, Lorraine's payment records, handwritten on lined notebook paper, the pediatric file, the footage timestamp I had scribbled on a napkin in Nolan's workshop, and the school photo, propped against the filing cabinet, Ruth Ann's eyes looking at me from a face I had never been allowed to know. I started matching dates. The loan application was filed on a Tuesday in October, 4 years ago. $85,000 I had said no. 6 days later, the following Monday, the footage showed Garrett opening my ranch gate at 2:14 a.m., while Jolene carried a sleeping child from a car into my house. 6 days. That's how long it took my son to go from being denied a loan to deciding that 2 children were a better line of credit. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst was the 11-day gap. Lorraine's payment log showed the first deposit hitting her account 11 days after the swap. Not weeks, not months. 11 days. Which meant Garrett hadn't found Lorraine after the swap. He had found her before. She was already recruited, already waiting in Mineral Wells with a room prepared, before Jolene ever carried that boy through my gate. The scheme wasn't improvised. It was built like a business plan with children as the inventory. I sat there, circling dates with a ballpoint pen until the ink started to skip. The desk clock ticked past midnight. Coyotes called somewhere beyond the south fence. The coffee in the mug at the corner of my desk had gone cold hours ago, but I drank it anyway because the bitterness felt appropriate. The math was not complicated. Lorraine's monthly payments over 4 years. The care subsidies Garrett had accessed by claiming a dependent he had hidden. The household money I had spent raising Colton. Clothes, food, school supplies, doctor visits, money. I gave freely because I believed I was raising my grandson. The redirected family funds. When I added it all together, circling the final number twice and underlining it, the total approached $180,000. If you've ever trusted someone so completely that you stopped counting the money, you'll understand how a man can lose that much without noticing. Because you're not losing dollars, you're spending love. And love doesn't come with a receipt. Before I tell you what I finally said out loud in that empty room, are you still with me? Drop your guess in one sentence. What do you think drove Garrett to go this far? Because this next part is the turning point. Please note, some details ahead are dramatized for narrative depth. The core truth is what I hope stays with you. I pushed back from the desk and looked at the numbers one more time. Colton was the decoy. A child placed in my home to keep me busy, keep me spending, keep me blind. Every dollar I poured into raising him was a dollar Garrett didn't have to earn. And Wyatt, my blood grandson, was the product. Hidden in a rented house, generating subsidy payments, kept out of sight so the decoy could keep working. Both children, used as financial instruments, not by a stranger, not by some faceless corporation, by my son. By the boy I taught to ride a horse and tie a bowline and shake a man's hand like he meant it. There is a moment when grief turns into something harder, something with edges, and you can feel it happen the way you feel a bone set. It doesn't feel better. It just feels permanent. I spoke the words out loud, not to anyone. To the empty room, the cold coffee, the cedar walls that had heard 40 years of my conversations with Ruth Ann and were now hearing this. He sold both my grandchildren for money, just in different ways. My voice didn't crack. I had expected it to. But the words came out flat and steady the way a nail goes into a board when you hit it clean. And once they were in the air, they couldn't be taken back. They were true. They were permanent. They were the answer to the question I had carried home from Nolan's workshop. Why? Because money. Because debt. Because my son saw 2 children and calculated their value the way another man might calculate the value of a piece of land. What it could produce, what it could leverage, what it could be made to generate without anyone noticing until it was too late. I closed the folder. I stacked every document into a single pile, the loan application on the bottom, the payment logs in the middle, the medical records and the footage napkin on top. I placed the flash drive on the pile like a period at the end of a sentence. I had the full picture now. Every dollar, every date, every lie. What I didn't have was a lawyer, someone who could look at this pile and tell me whether the law could do what I was about to ask it to do, prosecute my own son for turning his children into a revenue stream. And that meant calling a man I hadn't needed in years, a man who handled ranch disputes and custody cases, and asking him whether what Garrett did had a name in a courtroom. I called Boyd Harrington at 7 the next morning. His secretary told me he was booked solid through Friday, but when I said the word grandchildren, she went quiet for a moment, then told me to come in at 9. She put me in the conference room and closed the door. Boyd was 64 years old, a family attorney in Abilene who had handled ranch disputes and custody cases across Erath County for 3 decades. He was tall and lean, with silver hair, and the unhurried manner of a man who had heard every kind of trouble and learned not to flinch at any of it. He walked in carrying a yellow legal pad and a coffee mug that said, "World's Okayest Lawyer," and he sat across from me without saying a word while I opened the folder. I laid everything out on his oak conference table. The loan application, Lorraine's payment logs, the medical records, the footage timestamp. And then I opened the laptop I had borrowed from Nolan and played the 17 minutes of recovered video. Boyd watched the entire footage without moving. His pen tapped the desk once, twice, and then stopped. When the screen went dark, he sat back in his chair and looked at me with an expression I had never seen on a lawyer's face before. Not professional calculation, but something closer to sorrow. "This is enough," he said. "This is more than enough for criminal charges. Child swap fraud, care subsidy fraud, child abandonment. But I need you to understand something before we go any further." He leaned forward. "Once we file, your son goes into the system. There is no pulling this back. He faces prison. Jolene faces prison. And the moment charges are filed, Colton's custody situation becomes a legal question. He has no biological connection to you. His actual parents will be defendants in a criminal case. The state may move to place him. You want to know what justice costs when the criminal is your own child? It costs everything you thought you were saving by seeking it in the first place." "Place him where?" I asked, though I already knew. "Foster care. Temporary placement, while the courts sort out parentage. It could take months, and I can't guarantee they'll place him back with you." I sat with that for a long time. The coffee from the secretary's pot sat untouched in front of me. Boyd waited. He was good at waiting. "I know what it costs," I said finally. "I also know what it cost those boys for 4 years while I did nothing." Boyd nodded. Then he picked up the phone on the conference table and dialed. I heard ringing, then a voice I recognized, Lorraine. "Mrs. Poole, this is Boyd Harrington, attorney in Abilene. I'm here with Mr. Caldwell. Are you willing to give a sworn statement regarding the arrangement you had with Garrett Caldwell?" A pause. Then her voice came through the speaker, thin but steady. "Yes, I should have called sooner." Boyd hung up and looked at me. "We can file tomorrow. I'll contact the sheriff's office and arrange for Garrett and Jolene to be brought in for questioning. But, Virgil, you need to go home tonight and think about what comes after. Not the charges, the children, both of them." I drove home through the late afternoon with the folder on the seat beside me, and Boyd's warning sitting in my chest like a stone. The boys were in the kitchen when I walked in. Colton doing his spelling words at the table. Wyatt sitting across from him drawing the barn cat on a piece of construction paper. Darlene had made them grilled cheese. The house smelled like melted butter and warm bread, and for one moment it felt like a normal home with a normal family doing normal things on a Tuesday evening. How do you choose between two doors when behind each one is a sleeping boy who calls you Grandpa, and the law says you might only be allowed to keep one? I put them to bed at 8:30. Colton got his chapter of the Western paperback. Wyatt got a new story, one I made up on the spot about a barn cat named Juice who went on adventures. He almost smiled. I pulled his door shut, and then pulled Colton's shut, and then I stood in the hallway between them. Colton's door on the left, Wyatt's door on the right. 2 boys, 2 rhythms of breathing, 2 small lives that my son had treated like inventory, and that I had come to love with the kind of love that doesn't negotiate. A hallway is just a hallway until you stand in one at midnight with your hands on 2 doors and your whole life balanced between them. Then it becomes the longest room in the house. The law could give me justice or it could give me my grandsons. Boyd hadn't promised it would give me both. Filing charges might save Wyatt and lose Colton. Not filing might protect Colton but leave the crime unpunished and both boys at risk. There was no move on this board that didn't cost something I couldn't afford to lose. I pressed my left hand flat against Colton's door. I pressed my right hand flat against Wyatt's. I stood there like a man holding 2 walls apart. The wood warm under my palms, the house settling around me in the October cold. I will not lose either one of these boys. I said it out loud. To the hallway, to the doors, to Ruth Ann, wherever she was, and tomorrow I would walk into the sheriff's office and start the war that would let me keep them both. Boyd Harrington was already waiting in the parking lot when I pulled up to the Erath County Sheriff's Office at 8:15 with the folder on the passenger seat. He leaned against his sedan in a pressed gray suit, coffee in one hand, briefcase in the other. "You sure about this?" he asked. I picked up the folder and the flash drive and said, "I was sure at 3 in the morning. Let's go." The deputy they brought us to was not the voice I'd spoken with on the phone 2 weeks earlier. Deputy Harlan Bates was a broad-shouldered man in his mid-40s who had worked the Erath County Sheriff's Office for 18 years and spoke like he had all the time in the world until he didn't. He shook our hands without smiling and gestured us into a windowless room with a metal desk and 2 chairs that had seen better decades. The fluorescent lights buzzed at a frequency that burrowed into the back of your skull. I pushed the folder across the desk. Bank statements. Dr. Hadley's blood type report. The timeline Boyd and I had assembled the night before. Then I set the flash drive beside them, small enough to lose between couch cushions, heavy enough to end a family. 17 minutes of security footage, I said. Recovered from a camera system my son tried to wipe. It shows a woman carrying my grandson out of his crib at 2:14 in the morning and replacing him with a different child. Bates plugged the drive into the department laptop without another word. Filing a police report against your own son is like setting fire to a bridge while you're still standing on it. You feel the heat under your feet before you even strike the match. I sat in that metal chair and watched a law enforcement officer watch my family fall apart on a 9-inch screen, and the only thing I felt was 4 years pressing down on my chest like wet concrete. Bates watched the entire clip without pausing. When it ended, he closed the laptop and stood. "Mr. Caldwell, I'm going to step out for a minute. When I come back, we're going to do this by the book." He was gone 11 minutes. I counted every one by the second hand on the wall clock. When he returned, he had a legal pad and a different look on his face. "The woman in the footage," he said. "Dark hair, mid-30s, thin build. I know her." My stomach dropped. How? 4 years ago, almost to the week, I pulled over a vehicle on Route 281 at approximately 2:45 a.m. broken tail light. The driver matched that description. Nervous, hands shaking, said she was visiting a friend. I wrote the citation and let her go. He tapped his pen against the pad. "That citation is in the system. Date stamped. It puts her on the road 20 minutes after your footage ends." Boyd leaned forward. "That's independent corroboration of the timeline." "I'm aware," Bates said. He looked at me. "I'm calling your son and daughter-in-law in this afternoon. I'll tell them it's about the highway incident with the minor. That gives us a reason that won't spook them." Boyd put his hand on my arm. "Virgil, once he makes that call, your son will know. There's no undoing this." I looked at the folder spread across that metal desk. 4 years of lies, printed and organized into tabs. "It was undone 4 years ago," I said. "I'm just putting it on paper." Bates made the call at 9:50. I heard him use the word routine. Then Boyd and I sat in a waiting room with vending machine coffee that was bitter and barely warm, and we waited for my son to walk into the building where his life was about to change. You want to know what a guilty man looks like when he doesn't know he's caught? He looks relaxed. He smiles at the receptionist. He asks if this will take long because he has errands to run. That is exactly what Garrett did when he walked through the front door at 1:47 that afternoon. Jolene was 2 steps behind him, quieter, her purse strap twisted tight in both hands, but Garrett moved through that lobby like a man picking up a parking ticket. "Deputy, if this is about that boy on the highway, I already told the other officer I don't know anything about." "Have a seat, Mr. Caldwell. This isn't about the highway." Garrett's smile didn't vanish. It froze at the corners like a photograph of someone who used to be confident. They separated them. Jolene went left, Garrett went right. The door was cracked an inch, enough to hear. I watched from the hallway through a window no wider than a hymnal, close enough to see his cologne fog, the small room but far enough that he couldn't see me. Bates sat across from Garrett and let him talk. Let him explain about the highway, about Wyatt, about how none of it involved him. Bates nodded along like a man listening to a weather report he already knew was wrong. Then Bates placed the tablet face down on the table the way a dealer lays a card. Garrett glanced at it. Bates turned it over, pressed play, and said 2 words. "Watch this." The color left my son's face before the first second of footage was over. I watched my son watch himself commit the worst act of his life, and I watched him try to find a lie fast enough to outrun 17 minutes of footage. His jaw moved before his brain caught up. His eyes darted to Bates, then to the door, then back to the screen, where a woman carried a sleeping child through a gate that Garrett himself was holding open. "That could be anyone," he said. His voice cracked on the second word. "You can barely see. The angle is... That's not clear enough to..." Bates let the footage run. He didn't argue. He didn't need to. The timestamp in the corner matched the bank records to the hour, and the woman's face turned toward the camera at the 4-minute mark with enough clarity to fill a wanted poster. Garrett shifted tactics the way a drowning man grabs at anything within reach. "She's the one who carried the boy out of the car, not me. I didn't touch." From the adjacent room, through a wall thin enough to hear a cough, Jolene's voice exploded like a bottle thrown against concrete. "He planned it. He drove. He told me exactly what to do and when." Garrett flinched. Bates didn't. "You want to know how fast loyalty disappears between 2 people who built a life on a lie? About 4 seconds. That's how long it took Garrett to point at Jolene and Jolene to scream back through the wall. 4 years of shared secrets, shared bank accounts, shared silence, and it evaporated the moment the room got small enough. They turned on each other with the speed of people who had always known this moment was coming, and had already rehearsed their version of who was less guilty. Betas rewound the footage and played it again. This time he paused it at the 2-minute mark, the frame where the vehicle's license plate was visible under the porch light. "Mr. Caldwell, I pulled your wife over for a broken taillight that same night, same road, same vehicle. Want to keep going?" Garrett's mouth opened. Nothing came out. His hands, which had been gesturing and pointing and performing since the footage started, went flat on the table and stayed there. The cologne he'd walked in wearing had turned sour in the small room, mixed with sweat and recycled air, and I could smell it from where I stood in the narrow hallway, watching through the observation glass. In the other room, Jolene was crying. Not the controlled kind. The kind that comes with mascara streaking down both cheeks and fingernails, leaving marks on the table's edge. Bates had a second deputy with her, and through the door's narrow window I could see her mouth moving fast, spilling everything. Dates, amounts, Lorraine's name, like a dam that had held for 4 years and finally split down the center. I had imagined this moment 100 different ways on the drive home from Nolan's workshop. In every version I was loud. In every version I was angry. I had sentences prepared, accusations sharpened, a father's rage loaded and ready to fire. But when Bates opened the door and said I could go in, all the volume left my body like air from a punctured tire. What came out instead was worse than shouting. I sat down across from my son. The table between us was narrow enough that our knees nearly touched. Garrett looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes and a face I'd known for 42 years rearranged into something I didn't recognize. half defiance, half terror, and underneath both, the expression of a boy who got caught and is waiting to hear how bad it's going to be. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke so quietly that Garrett had to lean forward to hear me, and when he did, the distance between us closed to less than 2 feet. "Why didn't you just come to me and tell the truth?" I said. "I had the money. I would have helped you. You know that. What do you do with the son who chose a 4-year crime over a 5-minute conversation? You sit across from him in a sheriff's station and you ask him why, and you watch him discover he doesn't have an answer." Garrett opened his mouth. Dad, The sentence broke apart like wet paper. He tried again and got less far. His hands slid off the table into his lap, and then his head followed, forehead pressing against the cold metal surface with a sound that was quieter than anything else that had happened in that room, but somehow louder than all of it. I wasn't crying. His shoulders didn't shake. He was just empty. 42 years of charm and angles and shortcuts, and it all ended with his face against a government issue table in a room that smelled like sweat and cleaning solution. Bates looked at me from the doorway and said quietly, "We'll process them both tonight. Arraignment is in the morning." I stood up. I looked down at my son one more time, at the back of his head, at the shirt collar dark with perspiration, at the hands curled in his lap like a child's. I turned the door handle and walked out without saying another word, because every word I had left was for the 2 boys waiting at home. The handcuffs made a sound I will never forget, a small, clean click, like a latch closing on a gate that would never open again. I stood in the hallway and watched a deputy fasten them around my son's wrists, while a second pair locked around Jolene's in the booking area across the hall. Neither of them looked at each other. Whatever partnership they'd had died in those interrogation rooms, and what was left was 2 people in separate corners of the same sinking boat, each pointing at the other. They were led to different processing stations. Fingerprints, photographs, personal effects sealed in labeled bags. Garrett's wallet, his phone, his watch, the one I'd given him for his 30th birthday, all dropped into a manila envelope like items from a lost and found that nobody would claim. I was sitting in the lobby, drinking water from a paper cup, when Lorraine Poole walked through the front door. She looked smaller than she had at the diner in Mineral Wells, her coat buttoned to the collar against the October wind, a canvas bag under one arm stuffed with papers. Bates met her at the front desk and walked her back to the same room Garrett had sat in an hour earlier. She sat in that chair and told the truth in 20 minutes that my son hadn't managed in 4 years. I watched through the hallway window as she spread her records across the desk. Handwritten payment logs in a spiral notebook, deposit slips rubber-banded by year, a prepaid phone with Garrett's number saved under a fake name, and a school photo of Wyatt taken at a Mineral Wells Elementary that I had never known existed. "He told me the boy's mother couldn't handle him," Lorraine said. Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't. I believed it for 2 years. By the 3rd year, I stopped believing it, but I didn't stop cashing the checks, and I have to live with that. Lorraine Poole sat in the same chair my son had occupied and handed over every piece of evidence voluntarily. The difference between those 2 people in that same seat was the difference between a wound and the knife that made it. She had done what Garrett should have done. She had loved a child that wasn't hers. She did it for $1,500 a month. Garrett did it for 10 times that amount and called it necessity. When she finished her statement, Bates asked her to sign 3 forms. She signed each one without hesitation. Then she walked into the hallway where I was leaning against the wall with my shoulder pressed to cold cinder block, and she gripped my hand with both of hers. Dry and firm, the hands of a woman who had scrubbed floors and packed lunches and braided hair that wasn't her responsibility to braid. "I never stopped caring for him, Mr. Caldwell," she said. "I want you to know that. He never went hungry. He never went a night without someone checking on him." I nodded because my throat had closed and words weren't available. She held on for another moment, then let go and walked out the same door she'd come in, and the drugstore perfume she wore, the same scent from the diner, lingered in the hallway like a grace note at the end of a hymn. You think you want to hear your child say sorry. You think that word will close something. It doesn't. It opens everything, because now you know they knew, and they did it anyway. Garrett came down the hallway 40 minutes later with Bates's hand on his elbow. His shirt collar was dark with sweat. His eyes were swollen but dry. He walked with the shuffle of a man whose shoes had been taken and replaced with facility slides, and the sound they made on the linoleum was the kind of quiet that fills a room. He saw me against the wall and stopped. Bates led him. Garrett looked at me, not with defiance, not with the performance I had watched him give his entire adult life. He looked at me the way he used to look at me when he was 9 years old and had broken something he knew he couldn't fix. His lips moved once without sound. Then he whispered 2 words. "I'm sorry." 2 words, 4 years too late, but I heard them. And the worst part was that I believed him. Not because he deserved to be believed, but because sorry was the only word he had left that wasn't a lie. He had known what he was doing. He had known the entire time. And that knowledge made the apology real and the crime worse in the same breath. Bates guided him forward. Garrett turned the corner, and the holding cell door made the same sound as the handcuffs. That clean, final click. 2 clicks in one afternoon, one for the wrists, one for the door. And somewhere between them, the last thread connecting me to my son as I'd known him went slack. I drove home in the dark with the windows down because I needed air that didn't smell like that station. The night tasted of cut grass and the first edge of autumn. The boys would be asleep by now. Tomorrow I would have to explain something to them. Not everything, not yet, but something. And before I could do that, I had to answer the question Boyd had asked me that morning. It was the one I'd been dodging since the blood type report landed on my kitchen table. Which boy stays and which boy goes? Boyd had a yellow legal pad in front of him with 2 columns drawn in blue pen. One labeled W.I.A.T., the other labeled Colton. And I hated him for about 3 seconds before I realized he was trying to save me. I had driven to his Abilene office the morning after the arrest with no sleep and no plan, only the question that had followed me home through the dark. He pushed his reading glasses up onto his forehead and leaned back in his leather chair. The office smelled like old case files and furniture polish, and the afternoon light through the blinds cast bars across the desk that looked too much like the ones I'd watched close behind my son 2 days earlier. "The court will give you Wyatt," Boyd said. "He's your blood. The DNA will confirm what the vaccination scar and the blood type already tell us. But Colton, you have no biological claim, no legal guardianship on file, and his actual parents are about to face felony charges. The state will place him. Place him where? Foster care. A good home, hopefully, but I can't promise you it'll be yours." I looked at the legal pad. 2 names and 2 columns. 4 years of life reduced to a choice between left and right on a piece of yellow paper. Boyd's pen had drawn the dividing line so straight it could have been done with a ruler, and something about that neatness made my stomach turn, as if the decision itself could be that clean. How do you explain to a court that a child who isn't yours by blood is yours by every other measure that matters? Buy 4 years of bedtime stories and Tuesday chocolate milk and a hand reaching for yours in a parking lot. By a boy who named a barn cat and invented a cowboy who rides through canyons at night. The law doesn't have a column for that. Boyd's legal pad didn't either. The cleanest path, Boyd continued, tapping his pen once against the pad, is to petition for Wyatt and let the system find a placement for Colton. It's faster, it's cheaper, and the court will approve it without a fight. He paused. The alternative is petitioning for both. Emergency guardianship for Wyatt based on blood and a separate petition for Colton based on established caretaker status and best interest of the child. That's a longer road, Virgil, higher cost, and I cannot guarantee the outcome. The system that had helped me catch the people who stole my grandson was now preparing to separate the boys I'd fought to protect. The same legal machinery that processed Garrett's handcuffs would process Colton's placement papers, and both would carry the same institutional indifference. Efficient, procedural, and blind to anything that couldn't be entered into a database. Boyd, I tucked that boy in every night for 4 years, I said. I taught him to tie his boots and ride a horse and say grace before supper. You're asking me to hand him to strangers because his blood doesn't match mine. Boyd took off his glasses entirely and set them on the desk. I'm not asking you to do anything, Virgil. I'm telling you what the law sees. What you do with that is yours. If someone ever sits you down and draws 2 columns on a legal pad with a child's name at the top of each one and asks you to pick, I hope you do what I did. I stared at that pad until the ink blurred, and I refused to choose because choosing meant admitting that love has a limit. And mine doesn't. It never did. Not when my wife was dying, and not when my son was lying, and not now, sitting in a lawyer's office with a cup of coffee I hadn't touched going cold beside my elbow. The silence lasted long enough for Boyd's chair to creak twice. He didn't rush me. That was the thing about Boyd. He understood the difference between a client thinking and a client stalling, and he gave me the room for the former without mistaking it for the latter. I put my hands flat on the desk, the way I'd seen Garrett do in the interrogation room, except mine weren't surrendering. I looked at the legal pad one more time. Give me 1 night. 4 words. I said them like a man asking for water. Not because 1 night would be enough, but because it was all I could carry out of that office without breaking. Boyd nodded and closed his notepad without writing anything in either column. I drove home without the radio, without the windows down, without anything except the sound of the engine and my own thinking filling the cab like smoke. Somewhere between Abilene and Stephenville, I passed a church sign I hadn't read in years. White letters on a black board, something about doors and knocking. And I thought about stopping. I didn't. But by the time the gravel crunched under my tires and the ranch gate appeared in the dusk, I knew what I was going to tell Boyd in the morning. And it wasn't what he expected. Ruth Ann would have known what to do in about 10 seconds. She always did. And I sat in her rocking chair on the porch that night trying to hear her voice one more time. The boys were asleep inside. The ranch was quiet except for coyotes calling somewhere past the east fence line, and the October air carried cedar and dry grass and the kind of cold that settles into your knees before it reaches the rest of you. I had pulled a blanket across my lap and brought a mug of coffee that went cold in the first hour and stayed in my hand anyway, more for the weight of it than the warmth. Moths circled the porch light above me in patterns that never repeated, and I watched them the way you watch something when your mind is somewhere else entirely. I replayed it all. The quiet years after Ruth Ann died, when the house got so big I stopped using half the rooms. Garrett pulling away by degrees, Fewer calls, shorter visits, excuses stacked like cordwood until I stopped asking. Then Colton arriving on this same porch in a blue windbreaker, 5 years old, with his mother's nervous hands and his father's easy smile, and me believing every word because I wanted to. 4 years of bedtime stories. 4 years of boots tied on this same porch step. 4 years of a boy who wasn't mine by blood becoming mine by every clock and calendar that matters. And then Wyatt. A boy on a highway shoulder in a thunderstorm, whispering to a barn cat he named on the first afternoon, reaching for my hand in a parking lot like he'd been waiting his whole life to find it. Stars don't care about bloodlines. They shine on every roof the same way. On the house where a boy was hidden, and the ranch where another was planted under a false name. That night they shone on me, sitting in a dead woman's rocking chair, trying to be half as wise as she was. Ruth Ann used to say that family isn't who shows up in your blood, it's who shows up at your door. 2 boys showed up at my door, one by deception, one by a storm. Both of them mine. I realized, somewhere around 2 in the morning, with the blanket pulled to my chest and the coffee mug empty on the boards beside me, that the choice wasn't ahead of me. It was behind me. I had made it weeks ago, standing in a doorway between 2 bedrooms, whispering to a sleeping child that no matter who he was still my grandson. Everything since, the evidence, the confrontation, the arrest, had been my mind catching up to a decision my heart made before the blood type report ever landed on my kitchen table. I went inside at 4:30. I checked both rooms. Colton was curled on his side with one arm off the mattress. Wyatt was flat on his back with the cat at his feet. 2 boys breathing in the dark, neither one knowing that the man standing in the hallway had just decided to fight for them both against every legal boundary the state could build. If you ever have to choose between what the law calls logical and what your chest calls true, choose the chest. The law will find a way to catch up eventually. Your chest won't give you a second chance. I called Boyd at 6:15, before the sun cleared the tree line. He answered on the second ring, which told me he hadn't slept much either. Both of them, Boyd. File for both. I don't care what it costs, and I don't care how long it takes. Silence on the line. Then a breath. Virgil, Colton's biological parents are unknown. The court will need a full investigation before they can even consider. Then investigate. Hire whoever you need. File whatever has to be filed. I've got the resources and I've got the time, and those 2 boys have got nobody else. I was in his Abilene office by 9. The same desk, the same blinds, casting bars of light across the wood. But this time there was no yellow legal pad with 2 columns. Boyd had a fresh pad, blank and waiting, and he listened while I said it again face to face so there would be no misunderstanding. I had spent my whole life building a fortune and never once knew what it was for. Now I did. Every dollar I had was going to stand between those boys and the system that wanted to separate them. The same wealth my son had tried to exploit through a lie was about to undo every piece of damage he caused. Boyd set down his pen. He looked at me across the desk with an expression I had never seen from him in all our years of working together. Not professional, not cautious, just honest. "You've made the right choice of your life," he said. He shook my hand across the desk, firm and final. And then he pulled out that fresh legal pad and started writing. He said the guardianship hearing could be expedited given the criminal case, and with luck, we'd have a ruling before the sentencing. I nodded, because that was the other thing I hadn't told him yet. I wanted to be in that courtroom when they sentenced my son, with both boys' names on the petition in my pocket. The months between arrest and trial blurred together. The courtroom smelled like old wood and floor wax, and my son stood at the defendant's table in a county jumpsuit with his hands cuffed in front of him like a man I had never met. The approved guardianship petition sat folded in my jacket pocket, both names printed on the same page, and I pressed my palm against it once to make sure it was still there before I sat down in the third row of the gallery. The judge was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and reading glasses she never took off. She read the charges without inflection: child swap fraud, care subsidy fraud, child abandonment, and each one landed in the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water. Garrett stood with his attorney on one side and his whole ruined life on the other. Jolene went first. She stood when told to and immediately began talking before her lawyer could stop her. "He told me what to do with the boy," she said, her voice high and breaking. "Every step. I was following his—" The bailiff shifted, and her attorney put a hand on her arm, but the damage was already done. She got 4 years, state facility, eligible for parole in 2. Garrett spoke next. He didn't look at Jolene. He didn't look at me. He looked at the judge and said, "She planned it. I was trying to pay off the debt. I didn't think it would go this far." Even now, with the gavel out to fall, they were pointing at each other like two people fighting over who lit the match while the house burned to the foundation. You expect sentencing day to feel like the end of something. It doesn't. It feels like standing at a graveside for someone who chose to die. My son was alive in that jumpsuit, but the person I raised him to be was already gone. I sat in that gallery with my hands on my knees and the petition against my chest, and I didn't feel victory. I felt like a man burying someone who was still breathing. Garrett got 6 years. The judge cited the planning, the duration, the financial exploitation. She used the phrase "sustained pattern of deliberate deception," and I felt each word like a nail driven into wood I had built with my own hands. When the bailiff led him toward the side door, Garrett turned his head just enough to find me in the gallery. Our eyes met for less than 2 seconds. He didn't mouth anything. He didn't nod. He just looked, and then the door closed and he was gone. I walked out of that courthouse and the December air hit my face like cold water. For the first time in 2 months I could breathe without something sitting on my chest. Not because justice was done, but because it was over. The courthouse steps were bright with midday winter sun, and I stood there for a moment with my hand on the railing, letting the cold seep through my fingers, letting the weight shift from my shoulders to the concrete beneath my boots. Darlene Gentry had both boys in the truck in the parking lot, the heater running and the windows fogged. She'd taken them to the park that morning and fed them lunch at the diner on the square, keeping them busy while the law did what the law does. She saw my face when I opened the driver's door, and she squeezed my arm once without a word, then walked to her own car and drove away. That was Darlene. She always knew when to stay and when to leave. Colton was in the passenger seat with his boots on the dashboard. "Grandpa, where did you go today?" I pulled out of the parking lot and turned toward the highway. The sun was already low, December days being what they are, and the light came through the windshield warm and gold. "I went to take care of something so I could come home and tell you both the same thing," I said. "From now on, we 3 are family. That's all that matters, and that is not going to change. If you ever wonder whether words can build a house, I will tell you they can." I watched those words land in that truck cab, and I watched 2 boys receive them differently. Colton nodding like he'd been waiting to hear it out loud, and Wyatt going very still in the back seat the way he always did when something important was happening that he didn't quite believe yet. "All 3? Wyatt said from behind me. Quiet. Testing the word like a boy speaking a language he didn't trust yet. All three, I said. Colton reached over the seat and grabbed Wyatt's hand without being told. I watched them in the rearview mirror. Two boys holding hands on a December evening. The ranch gate coming into view ahead. The sunset throwing gold across the fields on both sides of the road. The truck tires found the gravel and the familiar crunch filled the cab. And I knew that whatever I had lost in that courtroom, I had found something in this truck that was worth every dollar, every sleepless night, and every door I'd ever had to walk through alone. The phone rang at 6 in the morning on a Tuesday in April, and for the first time in 6 months I didn't flinch when I heard it. It was Boyd, calling to confirm what the paperwork had already told me the week before. Both adoptions were finalized. Colton and Wyatt were mine. Not by blood, not by accident, not by a scheme hatched in the dark. By law and by choice, and by every morning I had woken up and decided to stay. I thanked him, hung up, and carried my coffee to the porch the way I had every morning since the snow melted. The spring grass had come in thick across the front pasture, and wildflowers lined the fence in patches of yellow and purple that Ruth Ann would have named and I never learned to. Her rocking chair sat in its same spot by the railing, empty and waiting the way it always was, and I settled into the one beside it with the mug warm between both hands. Colton came out first. Screen door banging behind him, boots already on, baseball glove tucked under his arm. He was 9, going on 10, and growing fast enough that I'd had to buy new jeans twice since Christmas. Wyatt followed a few minutes later, quieter, his glove held at his side like something he was still getting used to owning. He was in therapy every Thursday with a woman in Stephenville who specialized in children from disrupted homes, and some mornings he still wouldn't speak until noon. But this wasn't one of those mornings. They threw the ball back and forth on the grass, while I watched from the railing with my coffee steaming in the April air. The sound of a baseball hitting leather is one of the cleanest sounds there is. A small, honest pop that doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is. If you've been listening to this story, waiting for me to say I forgave my son, I haven't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But forgiveness isn't what this story is about. This story is about two boys on a spring morning throwing a baseball in the grass and an old man on a porch who finally understands what his money and his years and his sleepless nights were for. Colton threw one high and outside, and Wyatt stretched for it with both hands, the glove going up over his head, and caught it. The ball stuck in the webbing, and Wyatt stood there, staring at it like he'd pulled a coin from behind his own ear. "Grandpa, watch the—" "He caught it," Colton shouted, pointing. "He actually caught it." Wyatt held the ball up with a grin so wide it changed the shape of his face. "I caught it," he said. 6 months ago, that boy couldn't say my name without looking at the floor. Now he was standing in my pasture, holding a baseball over his head like a trophy. And maybe it was. Not every trophy comes with a plaque. Some of them come with stitched red seams and a 9-year-old's grin, and a morning so ordinary it could break your heart if you knew what it cost to get there. Ruth Ann would have loved them both without a single night of agonizing. She would have opened the door, pulled them inside, and started making sandwiches. I took the long way around, through a sheriff's office and a lawyer's conference room and a courtroom gallery. But I got to the same place she would have reached in 10 seconds. The long way taught me things the short way wouldn't have. It taught me that love isn't something you feel. It's something you file paperwork for at 6 in the morning and fight for in rooms that smell like floor wax and drive home from with your hands shaking on the wheel. The boys went inside for lunch, and I stayed on the porch with the last of my coffee going cold. 2 small shirts and 1 large one hung on the clothesline beside the barn, moving in the breeze like a family portrait made of cotton and wind. The pecan tree by the drive had leafed out full for the first time since the drought year, and somewhere in its branches a mockingbird was cycling through every song it knew. What makes a family? I used to think it was the name on the mailbox and the blood in your veins. Now I know it's simpler than that. It's who you choose to wake up for. The screen door banged open again, and both boys came running out asking if I wanted to play catch. I set my coffee on the railing, walked down the porch steps, and stood in the spring grass between 2 boys who called me Grandpa, one by habit, one by choice, both by love. The ball went back and forth between the 3 of us in the April sun, easy and unhurried, the way things move when they've finally found their rhythm. I spent 4 years not knowing the boy didn't share my blood. But I don't need DNA to know he's my family. I spent 4 years raising a boy I believed was my blood, and when the truth came out, I had a choice: walk away from the child who wasn't mine, or fight for both of them. I nearly let anger make that decision for me. Don't make my mistake of waiting for the world to force your hand. If you love someone, you choose them before the paperwork tells you to. That was the hardest lesson of my life, and it almost cost me 2 boys who needed me more than I knew. This family drama taught me something no revenge story ever could. Real strength isn't about getting even, it's about getting honest. I believe God put me through every sleepless night and every courtroom morning for a reason, so I could stand in a spring pasture between 2 grandsons and finally understand what my money and my years on this earth were actually for. A dad's true revenge isn't punishment. It's building something so solid out of the wreckage that the people who tried to break you have to watch it stand. That is the life story I never expected to live, and the storytelling I never thought I would share. If this family drama stayed with you, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me, would you have fought for both boys, or would you have taken the easier road? Be honest. Then share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you never miss another life story like this one. These revenge stories and the lessons inside them are why I keep sharing. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. Some details in this storytelling have been adjusted for narrative purposes. Any resemblance to real individuals is coincidental. The lesson, that is real, and I hope it stays with you. God bless.